Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. Donald Trump's consideration of a waiver for Hungary on Russian oil sanctions, just weeks after they were imposed, encapsulates the great paradox of American power in the 21st century. It reveals a country with enormous coercive capacity but lacking strategic coherence, a superpower capable of punishing its adversaries but unable to overcome its own contradictions. This is not simply a matter of diplomatic flexibility. It is a symptom of a deeper deterioration of the Western moral order, where the tools of economic warfare are used less for principle than for convenience. Sanctions have long served as America's preferred instrument of power, the invisible army of modern empire. They promise control without fighting punishment, without the moral taint of war. But their effectiveness depends on unity, the illusion of a united front between Washington and its allies. Once that unity is broken, the power of sanctions begins to wane. Hungary's resistance illustrates this fragility. A small European country dependent on Russian energy and skeptical of liberal orthodoxy has forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable reality. Economic coercion cannot sustain a moral empire when its own allies no longer believe in its mission. So Trump's calculus in considering the exemption is both pragmatic and desperate. In some ways, it reflects geopolitical realism, a recognition that Hungary cannot easily wean itself off its dependence on Russian crude without risking economic collapse. But in a deeper sense, it reflects a crisis of confidence. Washington fears that punishing Budapest too harshly will push it closer to Moscow, setting a dangerous precedent for other disillusioned European nations. To avoid that outcome, Trump is seeking to compromise, even if it means weakening the sanctions regime he himself has put in place. In doing so, he has confirmed a truth that American leaders have long sought to deny, that coercion produces defections faster than compliance. The moral dimension of this decision is equally profound. Sanctions are justified in the language of virtue as a punishment for aggression, corruption, or tyranny. But when Washington exempts an ally for strategic reasons, the moral argument collapses. The issue is no longer justice, but authority, who must comply and who can disobey. Trump's proposed exemption for Hungary turns sanctions from a moral statement into a transactional negotiation. The logic is clear. If you are useful to American interests, you can disregard the law. If not, you must bear its weight. This is not diplomacy, but the politics of selective virtue. From a broader geopolitical perspective, the event illustrates the exhaustion of the sanctions model itself. The United States has imposed economic restrictions on more than 40 countries, a sanctions empire that spans continents but has produced little lasting change. So the debate over Hungarian immunity is more than a footnote in energy diplomacy. It is emblematic of the disintegrating logic of empire. It demonstrates that coercion without engagement cannot endure, that an order built on dominance will eventually yield to the realities of interdependence. In Trump's wavering posture, the world sees not strength but indecision, not leadership but chaos. And in that hesitation lies the first sign of imperial exhaustion, the moment when power no longer believes in the righteousness of its cause. To understand the significance of Trump's wavering sanctions policy, we must look away from Washington and toward Budapest, a city that has mastered the art of survival among great powers. Hungary's position in this drama is not passive. It is a deliberate geopolitical balancing act. Viktor Orbán, Hungary's longtime prime minister, embodies a form of nationalism that is neither explicitly Western nor explicitly Eastern, a pragmatic sovereign that considers ideology secondary to survival. In a tightly interconnected global economy, sanctions that once isolated adversaries now encourage the creation of alternative systems, new energy routes, non-dollar trade regimes, and political alliances that bypass Washington entirely. Hungary's defiance is thus not an anomaly, but a harbinger of the post-sanctions world, one in which the costs of compliance far outweigh the benefits of compliance. This is not just a failure of policy, but also a failure of philosophy. It reflects the moral fatigue of a system that confuses punishment with leadership. The American state still believes it can control the world by decree, even as its decrees lose their force. Trump's move toward immunity exposes that illusion, the realization that even the instruments of empire now turn against their masters. The United States, once confident in its moral authority, now rules by exception, improvisation, and contradiction. It punishes and pardons at the same time, no longer sure which gesture serves its purposes. For Orbán, Russian oil is more than a commodity. It is a lifeline, and U.S. sanctions are not a moral imperative. They are inconveniences that must be managed. Hungary's energy dependence on Russia is a legacy of geography and history. With few natural resources, the country has long relied on Russian oil and gas imports. While most of Europe is trying to diversify its energy sources after the invasion of Ukraine, Budapest has chosen caution over confrontation. Orbán understands that for a small landlocked country with weak industry and inflationary pressures, moral gestures cannot fuel power plants or heat homes. His decision to maintain energy ties with Moscow is not seen as betrayal, but as realism. Hungary's stance is brutally simple survival over symbolism, but this realism also carries political calculations. Orbán has cultivated an image of a Western dissident, the only European leader willing to openly challenge Brussels and Washington. His defiance of U.S. sanctions serves multiple purposes. It reinforces domestic sovereignty, it stokes nationalist sentiment, and it signals, in this sense, Hungary's opposition to sanctions is not merely economic, it is also an ideological play, one designed to expose cracks in Western unity. Trump's consideration of sanctions waivers should therefore be understood as an acknowledgement of Hungary's influence. Despite its small size, Budapest has positioned itself as a key player in the fault line between NATO and Russia. Orbán understands that his country's value lies not in its strength, but in its ambiguity. He can threaten to tilt eastward to force concessions from the West. He can declare allegiance to the alliance while maintaining a quiet relationship with Moscow. This is small state diplomacy in an age of divided empires, the art of turning weakness into bargaining power. Economically, Hungary's position reflects a broader European dilemma. The continent's dependence on Russian energy is not simply a matter of price, it is a matter of design. For decades, the EU's prosperity has depended on cheap resources from the East and markets from the West. When Washington imposes sanctions, it expects compliance. But for many European countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, compliance comes at a high price. Orbán's rebellion is therefore not simply a political move. It is a symptom of a deeper structural contradiction in the Western economic order, the impossibility of moral separation from dependence. Philosophically, Sachs would interpret Hungary's position as a manifestation of the world's changing moral geography. The old dichotomy between democratic virtue and authoritarian vice no longer explains the behavior of states. Instead, states act out of necessity, not norm. In a global economy strained by sanctions, inflation, and instability, survival has become the new ideology. Hungary's insistence on autonomy, however cynical it may seem, reflects a broader trend. The disintegration of the Western moral consensus that once bound its allies Seen in this light, Trump's consideration of a waiver is not an act of generosity, but of recognition. He sees in Orbán's defiance not rebellion, but realism, an acknowledgement that American power has limits and that loyalty in a multipolar age must now be negotiated, not assumed. For a president who values negotiation over doctrine, Hungary's leverage is both frustrating and enviable. Hungary's resistance is therefore not an aberration, but a predictable response to this long cycle of overreach. The hypocrisy embedded in the sanctions system further accelerates its decay. While the U.S. punishes rivals like Russia for aggression, it simultaneously supplies arms to allies that violate human rights with impunity. While it demands that others cut off Russian oil, it tolerates similar dependencies when convenient. The moral language of sanctions, democracy, liberty, peace has become a rhetorical cloak for selective enforcement. When Trump contemplates an exemption for Hungary, he is not redefining the system. He is revealing its essence. It was never about law. It was always about leverage. The erosion of U.S. sanctions power is also philosophical. It stems from the collapse of what Sachs calls moral coherence, the sense that power must serve principle, not the reverse. In the early decades of the post-war order, American influence rested on the belief that its leadership aligned with universal values. Today, that alignment has fractured. The United States still commands financial institutions and global networks, but it no longer commands trust. At the heart of this erosion lies the overuse of sanctions themselves. Once designed for targeted pressure, they have become the default response to every political disagreement. The result is saturation, a global network of embargoes so extensive that it undermines the very system it seeks to preserve. Russia, Iran, and China have adapted by creating alternative financial and trade mechanisms, insulating themselves from U.S. dominance. Even smaller nations, sensing the exhaustion of American enforcement, increasingly hedge their bets between competing blocs. The weaponization of finance has reached the point of diminishing returns. It isolates the United States as much as it isolates its enemies. Sachs has often warned that sanctions represent not strength but weakness, the inability to persuade through cooperation. They reflect a shift from moral authority to punitive control, from leadership to management. By treating the global economy as an instrument of political punishment, Washington undermines the very stability it claims to defend. Each new sanction alienates an ally, distorts a market, and accelerates the diversification of global systems away from U.S. influence. Trump senses that Orbán is playing the same game as he is, politics without pretense power, without ideology. But this convergence of pragmatism hides a deeper danger. As small states learn to manipulate, the American sanctions regime has long been framed as the moral instrument of a righteous superpower, a peaceful alternative to war, a mechanism to enforce international order through economic precision. Yet behind the rhetoric of justice lies a system corroded by hypocrisy and exhaustion. Trump's wavering over Hungary's Russian oil exemption exposes what Jeffrey Sachs would call the imperial contradiction of economic coercion, the belief that the United States can police the world economically while ignoring the limits of its own legitimacy. For decades, sanctions served as Washington's substitute for diplomacy, a way to punish without negotiating, to dominate without deploying troops. But their effectiveness depended on the illusion of unity. Allies obeyed because they believed in the coherence of American leadership. That illusion is now breaking. Sanctions, once instruments of moral clarity, now symbolize moral fatigue, the exhaustion of an empire that governs by punishment because it has forgotten how to lead by example. Thus, Trump's Hungary waiver debate is not an exception to the rule. It is the rule, the symptom of a system running on inertia rather than conviction. It shows the world that America's economic dominance can no longer enforce moral obedience, that even small nations can negotiate with the empire on their own terms. Trump's hesitation to fully enforce sanctions on Hungary was not born of compassion or confusion. It was born of fear, not the fear of Russia's retaliation, but of Europe's defection. Beneath the surface of the sanctions debate lies a much deeper anxiety haunting Washington that the Western alliance, painstakingly constructed over decades, is beginning to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. Hungary's defiance is not an isolated act. It is a symptom of a broader unease spreading across the continent, the sense that American leadership has become more burden than anchor. In this light, Trump's pragmatic flexibility toward Hungary takes on a strategic logic. By offering exemptions, he seeks to prevent a chain reaction of dissent within NATO and the European Union. Better to appear inconsistent than to risk open rebellion. Yet every such concession weakens the moral core of the sanctions regime. The more Washington bends, the more it reveals its insecurity, that the empire no longer commands loyalty but negotiates it. Russia understands this dynamic intimately. For Moscow, the cracks in the Western alliance are not accidents but assets. The Kremlin knows that the battlefield of modern geopolitics is no longer limited to tanks and missiles, but extends into the psychological terrain of alliance management. Every quarrel between Washington and the European capital, every sign of hesitation or division strengthens Russia's position. Hungary's defiance, therefore, functions as a quiet victory for Moscow, proof that time and pressure erode even the tightest coalitions. At its core, Trump's potential exemption for Hungary reflects an instinctive recognition of fragility. For 70 years, the transatlantic relationship has been defined by U.S. dominance and European dependence, a hierarchy disguised as partnership. But the Ukraine war and the economic chaos it unleashed has exposed how uneven that relationship truly is. While Washington profits from energy exports, arms sales, and the global demand for the dollar, Europe bears the costs of sanctions, inflation, and instability. The U.S. can afford moral absolutism. Europe cannot. And nowhere is that tension more visible than in Hungary, where national survival collides with ideological obedience. Viktor Orbán's open defiance has become the canary in the coal mine of Western unity. Other European governments, from Slovakia to Austria, even to Germany, in quieter tones, share his concerns, but not yet his candor. They see what Orbán sees, a Europe trapped between American dictates and Russian energy realities. The fear in Washington is not that Hungary alone will slip from its grasp, but that it may lead others to question the wisdom of obedience. One defection can become contagion. This is not leadership. It is management of decline. The irony is profound sanctions meant to isolate Russia have, in effect, isolated America from the very moral community it once led. In pressing Europe to choose between principle and survival, Washington has forced its allies to confront a question once unthinkable, whether alignment with U.S. policy still serves Europe's long-term interests. Hungary's defiance is thus not rebellion, but revelation. It shows that the age of automatic alignment is over. Loyalty must now be earned, not assumed. For the first time since the Cold War, the West is discovering that its greatest threat is not the expansion of Russian influence, but the contraction of its own. The empire's fear of defection, Sachs would note, is the surest sign that its power is no longer magnetic, but brittle, held together by inertia and anxiety rather than shared belief. And in that fear, the world glimpses the end of an era, a West that once inspired now coerces, and a Europe that once followed now hesitates, poised uneasily between dependence and defiance. This is not leadership. It is management of decline. The irony is profound sanctions meant to isolate Russia have in effect isolated America from the very moral community it once led. In pressing Europe to choose between principle and survival, Washington has forced its allies to confront a question once unthinkable: whether alignment with U.S. policy still serves Europe's long-term interests. Hungary's defiance is thus not rebellion but revelation. It shows that the age of automatic alignment is over. Loyalty must now be earned, not assumed. For the first time since the Cold War, the West is discovering that its greatest threat is not the expansion of Russian influence, but the contraction of its own. The empire's fear of defection, Sachs would note, is the surest sign that its power is no longer magnetic, but brittle, held together by inertia and anxiety rather than shared belief. And in that fear, the world glimpses the end of an era, a West that once inspired now coerces, and a Europe that once followed now hesitates, poised uneasily between dependence and defiance. The debate over Hungary's exemption from sanctions is not simply a diplomatic episode or an energy dispute. It is a mirror reflecting the crisis of Western civilization itself. It exposes the collapse of coherence in a system that once justified its dominance in the language of morality, democracy, and law. What began as a question of oil has evolved into an indictment of the Western project, a civilization that can no longer reconcile its moral aspirations with its political behavior. In the old world order, America's moral authority was its greatest weapon. The Marshall Plan, the United Nations, and the post-war alliance system were built not merely on power, but on purpose. The belief that the West represented a higher form of governance, a fusion of liberty and responsibility. But over time, that moral clarity decayed into rhetoric. The same institutions that once promised peace now perpetuate division. The same democracy that once inspired emulation now exports coercion. Sanctions once framed as instruments of justice have become instruments of hierarchy tools, not of law, but of leverage. Trump's wavering over Hungary embodies the death of that moral confidence. His decision to punish and pardon in the same breath reveals a system that no longer knows what it defends. Is it freedom, stability, power, or simply inertia? When the world's leading democracy must bend its own principles to preserve obedience among its allies, it admits silently but unmistakably that its order is held together not by conviction, but by fear. This moral erosion carries profound geopolitical consequences. The more the United States uses sanctions as a tool of control, the more it accelerates the emergence of a multipolar world defined by resistance to that control. Russia, China, India, and the global South no longer see the West as the guardian of universal values, but as the custodian of a fading privilege. Hungary's quiet defiance, seemingly trivial in scale, therefore acquires immense symbolic weight. It represents the moment when even within the Western camp, obedience must now be negotiated, not assumed. Jeffrey Sachs would likely describe this as the inversion of legitimacy. In the 20th century, legitimacy flowed from ideals, democracy, justice, cooperation. In the 21st, it flows from necessity, energy, trade, and security. The result is a world where principle bends before pragmatism and where moral authority is measured not by righteousness, but by resilience. The West, having built its empire on universal rules, now governs through exceptions. Every sanction waiver, every tolerated violation corrodes the illusion of moral unity and hastens the decline of the order it was meant to preserve. This is the ultimate paradox of the sanctions era in trying to isolate its enemies. The United States has isolated its own ideals. Its pursuit of dominance has turned into a cycle of self-contradiction, preaching law while practicing power, invoking democracy while silencing dissent, defending alliances that increasingly doubt its purpose. The Hungary exemption debate is not about a single transaction. It is about the unraveling of a worldview that can no longer sustain its contradictions. Philosophically, this moment demands humility, the recognition that coercion cannot substitute for cooperation and that hegemony cannot masquerade as harmony. Sachs would remind us that civilizations do not collapse when they lose their strength, but when they lose their soul. The real crisis is not geopolitical, it is moral. The United States and its allies have reached the threshold where their own tools of influence, sanctions, alliances, and moral appeals have become self-defeating. The road ahead, then, is not one of renewed dominance, but of rediscovery. If the West is to survive as a moral and political force, it must abandon the illusion of moral monopoly and relearn the art of reciprocity, the humility to listen to, negotiate, to coexist. The alternative is fragmentation, a world where power replaces principle and where every act of control invites rebellion. Trump's dilemma over Hungary, viewed through this lens, is the parable of our time, the story of an empire caught between pride and fear, morality and manipulation. The question it leaves behind is larger than any presidency or policy can a civilization that governs by exceptions still claim to represent the rule of law? And in that question, Sachs might conclude, lies the West's final moral test, whether it can rediscover the meaning of justice before its empire of virtue collapses into an empire of survival.